The auctioneer's gavel hung suspended in the humid Kentucky air. As Cornelius Wickham led his horse into the ring, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd, not of admiration, but of barely contained laughter. The animal that shuffled behind. The weathered farmer was nothing short of pathetic, ribs visible through patchy coat, head hanging low, legs that seemed too thin to support even its meager frame. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer announced with forced enthusiasm, "lot number 47, a 3-year-old gelding named Tempest's Thunder." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Thunder? This skeletal creature looked like a gentle breeze might topple him over. From the premium seating section, Beauregard Ashworth III adjusted his silk tie and smirked. The oil magnate had flown in from Texas specifically for this auction, his private jet gleaming on the nearby airstrip. "Cornelius, you old fool," he muttered to his companion, banking heiress Vivian Montclair. "That nag belongs in a glue factory, not a horse auction." Vivian's diamond-studded fingers drummed against her pearl clutch as she surveyed the pathetic sight. "Darling, I've seen better-looking horses at a children's petting zoo." Whatever possessed him to bring that thing here? The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Prestigious horse trainer Maximilian Voss, whose stable had produced 3 Kentucky Derby winners, shook his head in disgust. "In 30 years, I've never seen such a disgrace brought to thoroughbred premier auctions." That farmer's lost his mind. Cornelius stood quietly beside his horse, seemingly oblivious to the mockery surrounding him. His calloused hands gently stroked Tempest's Thunder's neck, whispering words of encouragement. The 72-year-old farmer had worked these Kentucky hills for 5 decades, and his sun-weathered face told the story of countless dawns spent in the fields. "Starting bid is $500, the auctioneer called out, his voice lacking conviction. Silence. The crowd exchanged glances, some chuckling behind their hands. $500 for that creature seemed like highway robbery. "Do I hear 500? The auctioneer tried again, his professional smile beginning to crack. More silence, punctuated by a few snickers from the gallery. Beauregard leaned forward in his seat, his voice carrying across the arena. "Cornelius, save yourself the embarrassment. Take that poor animal home and put it out of its misery." The crowd erupted in laughter. Even the stable hands cleaning the arena couldn't hide their grins. But something strange happened then. As the laughter reached its peak, Tempest's Thunder lifted his head slightly and looked directly at Cornelius. The old farmer's eyes met his horse's, and for a moment, everything else faded away. There was something in that gaze, a spark, a promise, a secret understanding that no one else in that crowded arena could see. Cornelius had found Tempest's Thunder abandoned in a field 3 years ago, barely alive and clearly abused. While others saw only a broken animal, Cornelius had seen potential. He'd nursed the colt back to health, trained him with infinite patience, and discovered something extraordinary that no one else suspected. The auctioneer raised his gavel, preparing to move on to the next lot. "Going once for no bids." "Wait," called a voice from the back of the arena. All heads turned to see a young woman in modest clothing stepping forward. Racing journalist Octavia Thorne had driven 8 hours from Louisville, following a tip that had seemed too incredible to believe. Her press badge caught the light as she raised her hand. "I'd like to examine the horse first," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Before we continue." Octavia Thorne's request sent another wave of amusement through the crowd. The idea that anyone would want to examine that pitiful creature more closely struck most attendees as absurd. But the auctioneer, bound by regulations, nodded his consent. "Very well, Miss Thorne. You have 5 minutes for your inspection." As Octavia approached the center of the ring, Beauregard Ashworthy's voice boomed across the arena. "Sweetheart, you're wasting everyone's time. That animal couldn't outrun a 3-legged mule." The crowd's laughter followed her every step, but Octavia pressed on. She had built her reputation on investigating stories others dismissed, and something about the anonymous tip she'd received gnawed at her instincts. The caller had simply said, "Watch the skinny horse at today's auction. Look at his legs, really. Look." Cornelius watched nervously as the young journalist approached. He'd hoped to keep his secret until the right moment, but perhaps this was fate intervening. "May I?" Octavia asked, gesturing toward Tempest's Thunder. Cornelius nodded, his weathered hands trembling slightly. What happened next silenced the crowd entirely. As Octavia knelt beside the horse's front legs, her trained eye immediately spotted what everyone else had missed: the seemingly weak, thin legs weren't weak at all. They were perfectly proportioned, with lean muscle definition that spoke of incredible efficiency rather than malnutrition. The horse's coat, while patchy, showed signs of recent shedding, revealing glimpses of lustrous black underneath. But it was the hooves that made her gasp, "My God," she whispered, running her fingers along the perfectly formed coronet band. These weren't the hooves of a neglected farm animal. They were the hooves of a thoroughbred, expertly trimmed and cared for, with the distinctive conformation that spoke of generations of selective breeding. She moved to examine the horse's mouth, and Tempest's thunder, as if understanding the importance of the moment, allowed her to check his teeth. What she found there made her heart race. 3 years old, she announced to the crowd, her voice carrying a new authority. "But look at this dentition. This is premium bloodline stock." The laughter began to die down. Vivian Montclair leaned forward in her seat, her jeweled fingers gripping her clutch tighter. Octavia's hands moved to the horse's neck, feeling for the slight depression where a microchip would be implanted. Her portable scanner, standard equipment for any racing journalist, beeped as it detected the chip. The number that appeared on her screen made her blood run cold. Registration number TB4729-1X. She knew that number. Every serious racing journalist did. Her smartphone trembled in her hands as she pulled up the International Thoroughbred database. The search results appeared, and the arena seemed to tilt around her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "this horse is registered under the name Tempest's Thunder, but his original registration," she paused, double-checking the screen, "shows his bloodline traces directly to Northern Dancer and Secretariat." The crowd's murmur grew louder, but Octavia wasn't finished. More importantly, she continued, her voice gaining strength, "This horse's dam was Lightning's Promise, winner of the 2019 Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf. His sire was Midnight Revelation, who set track records at Belmont and Saratoga before his untimely death." The arena fell into stunned silence. Lightning's Promise was a legendary racehorse, and her offspring were worth millions. Midnight Revelation's bloodline was considered racing royalty. Maximilian Voss shot to his feet, his face pale. "That's impossible. Lightning's Promise only had two foals. One died, and the other disappeared 3 years ago," Octavia finished, her eyes moving between the horse and the crowd. "Stolen from Willowbrook Farm in Virginia. There was a nationwide search. A $2 million reward." Cornelius stepped forward, his voice quiet but clear. "I found him in my back pasture, half dead and scared. No identification, no papers. I reported it to the local sheriff, but no one came forward. I've been caring for him ever since." The crowd erupted in chaos. Beauregard Ashworth III was barking orders into his phone, while Vivian Montclair frantically whispered to her financial advisor. Maximilian Voss pushed through the crowd, trying to get closer to the horse. But Octavia held up her hand, and something in her demeanor commanded attention. "There's more," she said, her voice carrying across the arena. "I've been tracking a story about fixed races and stolen horses. This isn't just about bloodlines. If what I suspect is true, this horse represents something much bigger than any of us imagined." The arena buzzed with electricity as Octavia's revelation sank in. But the journalist wasn't finished. She pulled out a thick folder from her bag, documents she'd been investigating for months as part of a corruption expose. 3 years ago, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the arena. Midnight's legacy, that was his registered name before he became Tempest Thunder, was being trained for the Kentucky Derby. He was the favorite, odds on to win. But someone didn't want him to race. Cornelius stroked his horse's neck, his expression growing grim. "I always suspected something wasn't right. The way he was when I found him. It wasn't just neglect. Someone had hurt him deliberately." Octavia nodded, consulting her notes. "According to my investigation, there was a conspiracy involving several major racing syndicates. They knew Midnight's legacy was unbeatable, so they arranged to have him disappear. The insurance payout alone was worth $15 million. The crowd's murmur grew into a roar. Beauregard Ashworthy's face had gone ashen, and he was whispering urgently into his phone. Vivian Montclair looked like she might faint. But here's what they didn't count on, Octavia continued, her voice rising above the noise. Cornelius didn't just save this horse's life. He discovered something about him that the racing world had never seen. She turned to the old farmer. Tell them, Cornelius. Tell them what you found. The weathered farmer stepped forward, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. In the 3 years I've had him, I've been training him quietly. Not for racing, just for his own healing. But I noticed something extraordinary. He paused, his hand resting on Tempest Thunder's flank. This horse doesn't just run fast. He runs with perfect efficiency. Every stride is calculated, every movement conserves energy. It's like he's been designed by nature itself. Maximilian Voss, who had pushed his way to the front, scoffed. Impossible. I've trained champions for 30 years. No horse runs with perfect efficiency. Cornelius smiled quietly. Would you like to see? The old farmer whispered something to his horse, and what happened next would be talked about for decades to come. Tempest Thunder, who had appeared weak and pathetic just minutes before, began to transform. His head lifted, revealing a proud, noble bearing. His coat seemed to shimmer as he moved, the patchy appearance suddenly revealing itself as natural camouflage rather than neglect. His legs, which had looked thin and weak, now showed their true nature, perfectly calibrated instruments of speed and power. He's been hiding, Cornelius explained softly. 3 years of fear, of not knowing who to trust. But he's been healing, getting stronger, waiting for the right moment. Octavia's scanner beeped again, and she checked the reading. His heart rate is 60 beats per minute. For a horse's size, in this situation, that's almost superhuman calm. The crowd was mesmerized. Even Beauregard Ashworth III had stopped his frantic phone calls to stare. But there's one more thing, Cornelius said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something I've never told anyone. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather journal. I've been timing his training runs every morning for 3 years. We've run the same 2-mile circuit around my property. He opened the journal to the most recent entry. Yesterday morning, in the rain, carrying a full saddle. He ran those 2 miles in 3 minutes and 15 seconds. The silence that followed was deafening. 3 minutes and 15 seconds for 2 miles was faster than any recorded time in racing history. It was faster than seemed physically possible. Maximilian Voss's voice cracked as he spoke. That's impossible. The track record for the fastest 2-mile race is 3 minutes and 19 seconds, set by the legendary Windstorm in 1987, and that was on a perfect track with ideal conditions. Octavia added, her journalistic instincts taking over. What you're describing would make this horse the fastest ever recorded. Cornelius nodded. Solemnly, I've been waiting for the right time to reveal this. Waiting for someone who would believe me, who would give him the chance he deserves. The crowd erupted again, but this time it wasn't laughter. It was the sound of people realizing they were witnessing something historic. Beauregard Ashworth III stood up, his voice booming across the arena. I bid $5 million. The figure sent shockwaves through the crowd. $5 million was more than most horses sold for in an entire year of auctions. But Vivian Montclair was already on her feet. $10 million. The auctioneer, who had been stunned into silence, finally found his voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a bid of $10 million. Do I hear 11? The bidding war had begun, and everyone in the arena knew they were about to witness something unprecedented. The atmosphere in the arena crackled with tension as the bidding war erupted. What had started as a mockery of a skinny horse had transformed into the most intense auction in thoroughbred premier auctions history. 11 million. Maximilian Voss shouted, his 3 decades of training experience telling him this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Beauregard Ashworthy's oil fortune had made him accustomed to getting what he wanted. 15 million, he bellowed, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been outbid. The crowd gasped. $15 million was more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, and they were throwing these numbers around like pocket change. But Vivienne Montclair hadn't built her banking empire by backing down from a fight. Her diamond-studded fingers clutched her phone as she spoke to her financial advisor, then raised her hand decisively. 20 million. The auctioneer's gavel trembled in his hand. In 40 years of conducting auctions, he'd never seen anything like this. The previous record for a horse sale was 12 million, and they'd already shattered that. 20 million from the lady in Section A, he announced, his voice cracking with excitement. Do I hear 21 from the back of the arena? A new voice joined the fray. 25 million. All heads turned to see a man in inexpensive suit stepping forward. He had the bearing of old money, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. This was Pemberton Blackstone IV, heir to a railroad fortune and owner of 3 previous Kentucky Derby winners. 25 million from Mr. Blackstone, the auctioneer called out. Do I hear 26? Cornelius stood beside his horse, overwhelmed by the chaos surrounding them. Tempest's thunder remained calm, as if understanding that his moment had finally arrived. The old farmer's weathered hands shook as he realized his beloved companion was about to become the most expensive horse ever sold. Octavia Thorne worked frantically, live streaming the event to her racing blog. Her viewer count had exploded from a few hundred to over 50,000 people watching the historic auction unfold in real time. This is unprecedented, she narrated into her phone. We're witnessing the complete rewriting of horse racing economics. A horse that was dismissed as worthless 30 minutes ago is now the subject of the biggest bidding war in auction history. Beauregard Ashworth III wasn't about to be outdone by railroad money. 30 million, he roared, his face red with determination. The crowd erupted in applause and gasps. $30 million was entering the realm of abstract wealth, numbers that seemed to exist only in theoretical economics. But Vivienne Montclair had one more card to play. She stood gracefully, her pearl necklace catching the arena lights. $35 million, she announced with the calm confidence of someone who had never lost a business negotiation. Maximilian Voss threw his hands up in defeat. Even his most successful years had never generated the kind of money being casually thrown around. He stepped back, shaking his head in amazement. Pemberton Blackstone consulted his phone, speaking in hushed tones to someone on the other end. After a moment, he looked up with renewed determination. 40 million. The arena fell silent. $40 million was beyond comprehension for most people present. It was more money than entire corporations were worth. Beauregard Ashworth E's oil money was vast, but even he had limits. He sat down heavily, his face pale. I'm out, he muttered. Vivienne Montclair stood like a statue, her mind calculating. Rapidly, her banking empire could handle 40 million, but barely. And there was no guarantee the bidding would stop there. 42 million, she called out, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the sum. Pemberton Blackstone's phone rang, and he answered it immediately. The conversation was brief but intense. When he hung up, his expression was grim. I'm sorry, he announced to the crowd. I've reached my limit. The horse is yours, Ms. Montclair. The auctioneer raised his gavel, his hand trembling. $42 million, going once. But then something unexpected happened. A new voice cut through the tension, quiet but commanding. 45 million. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Cornelius himself, the old farmer who had brought the horse to auction in the first place. The crowd erupted in confusion. How could a simple farmer possibly have $45 million? Vivienne Montclair's eyes widened in shock. That's impossible. He's just I'm a farmer. Cornelius interrupted, his voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone. But I'm also the original owner of the land where Lightning's Promise was born. When they built the new highway through my property 20 years ago, I sold it to the state for $50 million. I've been living simply ever since, waiting for the right moment to use that money. He stepped forward, his weathered hand resting on Tempest Thunder's neck. This horse saved my life as much as I saved his. He gave me purpose again after my wife passed. He's not for sale. He's going home. The arena fell into stunned silence as the old farmer's words sank in. After all the millions bid, after all the powerful people involved, the horse was going back to the simple farm where he had found healing and love. The arena remained in stunned silence as Cornelius's words echoed through the space. $45 million from a simple farmer who had been hiding his wealth for decades. But the old man wasn't finished with his revelations. "There's something else you all need to know," Cornelius said, his voice carrying a new authority. "I didn't just find this horse by accident. I've been tracking the corruption in racing for 3 years, working with investigators, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth." He pulled out his phone and showed the screen to Octavia Thorne. "I've been recording everything. Every conversation, every suspicious transaction, every piece of evidence about the conspiracy that led to this horse's disappearance." Octavia's eyes widened as she realized the implications. "You're not just a farmer. You're an undercover investigator." "Former FBI," Cornelius confirmed. "I retired to farm. But when I found this horse tortured and abandoned, I couldn't let it go. I've spent 3 years building a case against the racing syndicate that tried to destroy him." The crowd buzzed with excitement, but Cornelius held up his hand for silence. "The people responsible for stealing Midnight's legacy are here today," he announced. "They came to this auction thinking they were safe, that their crime had been covered up. But I've been watching them, documenting their reactions, gathering the final pieces of evidence." He pointed directly at Beauregard Ashworth 3. "Your oil company provided the transportation trucks that were used to move stolen horses. The FBI has been monitoring your communications for months." Beauregard's face went white. Security guards were already moving toward him as he realized his empire was crumbling. "And you," Cornelius continued, turning to Vivian Montclair, "your bank laundered the insurance money from the stolen horses. Every transaction has been traced." Vivian's diamond-studded fingers trembled as she realized the magnitude of her exposure, her banking license, her fortune. Her entire life was about to collapse. "But the mastermind," Cornelius said, his voice growing cold, "has been hiding in plain sight." He turned to face Maximilian Voss, the respected horse trainer who had been voicing skepticism throughout the auction. "You orchestrated the entire operation," Cornelius accused. "You knew which horses were favorites, you arranged for their disappearance, and you collected insurance money while betting against them in fixed races." Maximilian's facade cracked immediately. "You have no proof," he snarled, but his voice betrayed his panic. "I have everything," Cornelius replied calmly. 3 years of surveillance, financial records, recorded conversations. The FBI has been building this case methodically, and today's auction was the final trap. As if on cue, federal agents flooded into the arena. The crowd watched in amazement as handcuffs were placed on some of the most powerful people in horse racing. Octavia Thorne live-streamed the entire arrest, her viewer count now approaching 1 million people watching the biggest racing scandal in history unfold in real time. "This is incredible," she narrated. "What started as a simple horse auction has become the exposure of a massive criminal conspiracy involving millions of dollars and some of the most powerful people in the sport." Through all the chaos, Tempest's thunder remained calm, as if he understood that justice was finally being served. The horse that had been tortured and abandoned had become the key to bringing down the entire corrupt system. Cornelius stroked his horse's neck gently. "You did it, boy. You helped us get them all." The auctioneer, still holding his gavel, looked around at the chaos with bewilderment. "So, what happens to the horse now?" "He's going home," Cornelius said simply. "Back to my farm, where he belongs." The $45 million bid was just to protect him from these criminals. Now that they're arrested, he's free to live the life he deserves. But Octavia stepped forward with one final question. "What about his racing career? A horse with his bloodline and speed. Doesn't the world deserve to see him compete?" Cornelius smiled, the first genuine smile he'd shown all day. "That's his choice to make. If he wants to race, we'll race. If he wants to stay on the farm, we'll stay on the farm. After everything he's been through, he's earned the right to decide his own future." As the arrests continued around them, the old farmer led his horse toward the exit. The crowd parted respectfully, understanding they had witnessed something extraordinary. The skinny horse that had been mocked and dismissed had not only broken auction records, but had brought justice to a corrupt system. He had proven that sometimes the most powerful victories come from the most unlikely sources. 6 months later, the early morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Cornelius's Kentucky farm. The sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink as an old farmer and his horse began their daily routine. But this wasn't the same pathetic creature that had shuffled into the auction ring half a year ago. Tempest Thunder now stood in his full glory, his coat gleaming black with hints of silver, his muscular frame perfectly proportioned, his eyes bright with intelligence and contentment. The transformation was complete, not just physically but spiritually. "What do you think, boy?" Cornelius asked, stroking the horse's neck. "Ready for today?" Today was special, after months of rehabilitation and training. Tempest Thunder had made his choice. He wanted to race not for money or glory, but to prove that survivors could overcome their past and achieve greatness. The Bluegrass Stakes at Keeneland would be his debut, and the entire racing world was watching. Pre-race odds had him as a heavy favorite, but that wasn't why thousands of people were making the journey to witness his first race. They were coming to see justice in action, to witness the triumph of resilience over corruption. Octavia Thorne had been chronicling the horse's recovery for months, her investigative reporting having won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing the racing conspiracy. She stood at the paddock entrance, camera crew ready, as Cornelius led Tempest Thunder toward the track. "How does it feel?" she asked. "To finally see him ready to race, like watching a miracle." Cornelius replied, his weathered face glowing with pride. "He's not just running for himself today. He's running for every underdog who's ever been dismissed, every victim who's been told they'll never recover." The crowd at Keeneland was unlike anything in racing history. Farmers stood next to millionaires. Children pressed against the rails alongside seasoned gamblers, and everyone shared the same sense of anticipation. In the jockey room, young rider Catalina Morales was preparing for the most important race of her career. Like Tempest Thunder, she had been overlooked by the racing establishment. Too small, they said, too inexperienced. But Cornelius had chosen her specifically because he saw the same fire in her eyes that he recognized in his horse. "He's been waiting for this moment his whole life," Cornelius told her as she prepared to mount. "Trust him. He'll take care of you." The walk to the starting gate was emotional for everyone present. Tempest Thunder moved with grace and power, his head held high, acknowledging the crowd that had once mocked him. There were no signs of the broken animal from the auction, only a champion ready to claim his destiny. The other horses in the field were impressive specimens, but they paled in comparison to the story being written around them. This wasn't just a horse race. It was a redemption story playing out in real time. "And they're off," the announcer called as the gates opened. What happened next defied description. Tempest Thunder didn't just run, he flew. Each stride was poetry in motion, each movement a testament to the power of patience and healing. He ran with the efficiency Cornelius had discovered, but also with joy, as if he were finally free to show the world his true nature. The crowd roared as he took the lead, but it wasn't the usual cheering for a favorite. This was something deeper, the sound of people witnessing the triumph of the human spirit, embodied in a horse who had refused to be broken. As they rounded the final turn, Tempest Thunder was 3 lengths ahead and pulling away. Catalina Morales barely had to guide him. He knew exactly where he wanted to go. The finish line approached, and 40,000 people rose to their feet as one. Tempest Thunder crossed the line 6 lengths ahead of the field, setting a new track record in the process. But the real victory wasn't in the time or the margin of victory. It was in the tears streaming down Cornelius's face as he embraced his horse, in the cheers of a crowd that had witnessed true justice, and in the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful stories come from the most unlikely sources. The winner's circle was crowded with reporters, officials, and well-wishers. But Cornelius only had eyes for his horse. "You did it, boy," he whispered. "You showed them all." Octavia Thorne approached for her post-race interview, but before she could ask her first question, Cornelius made an announcement that surprised everyone. "This victory belongs to everyone who's ever been counted out," he said, his voice carrying. "Across the track, the prize money, all of it is going to establish a foundation for rescuing abused horses and giving them second chances." The crowd erupted in applause. But Cornelius wasn't finished, and Tempest's Thunder has one more race in him. He continued, "We're going to the Kentucky Derby, not for money or fame, but to prove that healing is possible, that justice can prevail, and that sometimes the greatest champions come from the most broken places." As the sun set over Keeneland that evening, an old farmer and his horse walked quietly back to their trailer. The crowd had dispersed. The reporters had filed their stories, and the world was already buzzing about the upcoming Derby. But for Cornelius and Tempest's Thunder, the real victory was simpler than all the fanfare. It was the bond between a man who had never given up and a horse who had found the strength to trust again. They had proven that sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about the strong conquering the weak, but about the broken becoming whole, the dismissed becoming champions, and the forgotten becoming legends. As they drove through the Kentucky countryside toward home, Tempest's Thunder looked out at the rolling hills where he had found healing, knowing that his story was far from over. The skinny horse who had been laughed at had become something. More than a champion, he had become a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever been counted out. The greatest victory wasn't the race he had won, but the lives he had touched and the reminder he had given the world that every underdog deserves a chance to show their true greatness. And in the end, that was worth more than any record or prize money could ever be.